So, once more, welcome everyone to Insignia's final webinar of the year. My name is Jonathan Hemus. I'm the Managing Director of Insignia. We work with leaders of businesses around the world to help them do and say the right things on the most challenging days of their business lives. And it's great to see so many clients on the calls, but also other business contacts, partners, and it's wonderful also to see the geographic spread. I know we've got a good handful of people joining us from the States. Good to see you on the call, Gus. Good to see you on the call, Jim. And also in France, Germany, and also one or two further afield. So thank you all for joining us today. What we're going to do over the next hour is look at some of the notable crises over the last 12 months, not all of them because there have been many, sadly. Most importantly, we're going to be taking learnings out of those crises and having a think about what we can do as resilience, crisis management and crisis communication professionals to make our businesses and organizations more resilient based on the learnings of real life crises within 2024. We'll also be taking a look ahead at what we might be seeing in 2025. And also I've got some Christmas listening and Christmas reading suggestions if you just can't get away from crisis management even over the holiday period. So why is this important? Well, given the numbers on this call, I don't think I really need to explain that, but nevertheless, I will. From Insignia's perspective, really why we are here, why we're in business is because we believe that all organizations should be ready to prevent or overcome crises so they can avoid the damage to lives, livelihoods, business and reputation caused by a mishandled crisis. So today is just to play a very small part in helping us as crisis management professionals and all the people on this call to take a step towards preventing that needless harm that occurs when people get their crisis response wrong. So I'm going to show you some statistics in a couple of minutes about the prevalence of crises over the last 12 months, but I'm going to do a bit of audience participation time. There we go, and ask you this question. Has your organization faced a significant crisis management challenge? It says in 2023, it should say 2024. I'm 12 months behind. If you scan on that QR code and vote yes or no as to whether you have faced a significant crisis management challenge in the last 12 months, be fascinating to see what's going on within the, I think we've got around about 50 people on the line as it stands. So a pretty good sample size to see what's been going on out there. I can see the votes coming in, so I'm pleased to see that the technology is working. I'll give you another 30 seconds or so to cast your vote. Last chance to vote, give you 15 seconds before revealing the results. Any final votes to come through? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. So 59%, because I'm sure partly of the fantastic planning, training and exercising you've done, 60% did not face a significant crisis management challenge, but 40% did, despite your crisis management planning, training and rehearsing. So 4 out of 10 have had to deal with a really serious issue last year. And that kind of chimes in with the research that I'm about to show you, because the research does seem to suggest that disruptions are increasing PwC's risk report said that 96% of organizations experienced a disruption in the last 2 years, not 1 but 2 years, up from 2019, when only 69% of organizations had experienced the disruption in the last 5 years. So that seems to indicate that crises are becoming more frequent. If we look specifically at cyber, which we know is a risk type which is affecting every organization, Hiscox found that pretty much half of companies reported a cyber attack in the past 12 months. And the BCI, in their annual crisis report, reported that 85% of all global organizations experienced at least one supply chain disruption in the past year. Supply chain disruptions being another increasing risk that organizations are facing, whether that's caused by geopolitical events, cyber attacks, or simply breakdowns or accidents or power cuts. So we know we're facing a risky landscape. We know that crisis management plans may need to be deployed. So it's important that those crisis management plans and the teams required to deploy them are in good shape to do so. And as I mentioned earlier on, really today is about never letting a good crisis go to waste, because of course, every situation, near misses, incidents, major crises, whether it's your own or someone else's, provide us with an opportunity to learn. And learning and improving is a critical mark of a crisis-resistant organization. So we are going to take a look at a handful of crises, those which I think reveal some of the most powerful learnings, a number of them from the UK, but others from further afield, a couple of them global in nature. And I wondered what the people on this call saw as some of the year's most notable crises. You'll see I've got the year correct on this polling slide. Again, if you could scan the QR code and just name an organization or an event which you felt was particularly notable in terms of the crisis landscape this year. There's 3 or 4 people still typing, so I'll just give them time to finish. Still 4 people typing, so 15 seconds and then I'll press the button. Okay, a couple of people still going. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so interesting. So what are we seeing there? Well, one thing we are seeing very clearly is CrowdStrike. So I'm glad that I have included the longest section of the presentation on CrowdStrike. We're also seeing a number of cyber incidents. We're seeing quite a bit of geopolitical stuff in there as well, which have affected a number of organizations. And we see some of the big institutions like the BBC and the Church of England being at the heart of crises, the Royal Mail scandal, the ongoing Royal Mail scandal. So thank you. And I am pleased to say that a good, at least half of those mentioned on that page feature within this presentation. So given that cyber global IT outage, as it says on that page, features large on people's risk landscape, I wondered how many of you had actually seen, sorry, I'm getting my slide ordering wrong. I wanted to talk briefly about some of the cyber incidents that have hit organisations over the last 12 months. Everyone from Ticketmaster or Live Nation through to the Ministry of Defence in the UK, Transport for London, and Microsoft revealing that ransomware attacks against its customers nearly tripled during 2024. So cyber security and cyber incidents are still very much challenging organisations, and I wanted to draw out some of the learnings and some of the thoughts that we have about what that means in terms of your crisis preparedness. Well, I think the first thing to say is that cyber attacks are a fact of life, so you really must plan for them. I'm sure I am preaching to the converted here. And I think what's really important for your colleagues and your leaders to understand and recognise is that it's less the cyber attack that causes the real damage to an organisation. It's your response to it that has the power to do that. Why? Well, because cyber attacks are so prevalent that no organisation can protect themselves wholly from being the victim of a cyber attack, but people will expect you to respond well to it. And that's about fixing the problem and communicating well at the same time. So do everything you can to prevent the attack, but prepare rigorously for your response to it. It's a strategic business issue, not an IT issue. And anyone that still has responsibility for cyber security only represented within their IT or tech teams really is not looking at the organisation in the strategic manner that it should. It's critical to engage senior management in your planning. They will have to make some of the big decisions should a cyber incident occur. They need to understand the ramifications of those decisions. They need to understand the implications of certain systems going down and the reality of how quickly you would be able to get those systems up and running again. And they need to be defining ahead of time which are the systems that we are going to prioritize and how would we respond to ransomware attack in terms of, would we be potentially willing to pay, or under no circumstances would we pay? These are the conversations that need to be happening before the event through scenario planning, and they are some of the questions that a number of our clients have been grappling with over the last year. It's been really interesting to see that with a number of clients who have traditionally run what I might describe as sector-specific exercises, in other words, focused on their core business, they are instead rehearsing for a cyber attack, which was something that we wouldn't have seen 3 or 4 years ago. Plan and prepare your communication response. We have seen many organisations, rightly or wrongly, criticised for how they have communicated or sometimes failed to communicate to a cyber incident. There are, of course, a number of competing factors when thinking about communicating following a cyber incident. You will have legal requirements. You won't want to say too much. If you communicate too quickly, it may result in your call centres being overwhelmed or your website going as a result. But per previous points on this slide, prepare what your communication response should look like. Get template materials drafted. Make sure that you have contact details for all of those people that you might need to communicate with, and make sure that your call centres are geared up for an avalanche of calls should there be a cyber attack. So plan and prepare your communication response ahead of time, because in all crises, but particularly in the event of a cyber attack, your stakeholders will be asking two questions of your organization. Do they care? Do they really care that my data has been compromised, or that I can't use systems that are really important to me? And, you know, are they communicating that care and that empathy? And secondly, are they competent? Can they fix this problem? Was it their negligence that allowed this attack to happen? So both in your preparation, but critically in your response, you need to reassure your stakeholders of both of those things, that you do care about what's happened and that you are doing everything in your power to put the situation right, and doing it in an appropriately timely manner. So the question I was going to ask you a couple of minutes ago, a little bit too early, I'd be really interested to know, did your organization run a cyber crisis exercise in 2024? Again, there's just a couple more votes coming in. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So almost exactly, in fact, exactly 2/3 of you ran a cyber crisis exercise in 2024. And I think what's interesting there is, if we were to mention any other risk or type of crisis, I don't think there would be any other risk type that would have 2/3 of this audience saying, yes, we ran an exercise on this topic. And it just goes to show that this is a risk, clearly, which plays across all organizational types. It's not just financial services organizations anymore. It's not just online retailers. It's every single organization. And one could argue that the operationally focused organizations, those of you that run airlines or mines or manufacturing facilities actually, or hospitals, those are the ones where the need to prevent and respond well to a cyber attack is even greater. What I would implore you to do, if you're not already doing, is making sure that those cyber exercises are taking place at the right level. Yes, technical tests, penetration tests are really important. Yes, exercises involving your IT teams are really important, but it's critical to have your leadership teams engaged for the reasons that we talked about earlier. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next type of risk. And by the way, at the end, there will be time for questions or comments. So if you have any, please do enter them in the question box on your control panel, and we'll take a look at those later. Now, reputational risk and risk based on behaviours, culture, and ethics. This is a page of UK-focused reputational crises, but if you look at every country, every territory in the world, there will be organisations and individuals who have created and caused reputational risk for the organisation in which they operated, and, like the examples here, leaders of those businesses and organisations who are having to, willingly or not, take responsibility for what has happened under their watch. The three examples here are the royal family, very most recently Prince Andrew and links with an alleged Chinese spy, the Church of England and alleged cover-up or lack of action around allegations of child abuse. And the BBC, which has had a series of challenging people, behavioural issues to deal with throughout 2024, beginning with Hugh Edwards, the high-profile newsreader, through to allegations about Russell Brand, who was one of their high-profile presenters, allegations of bullying on Strictly Come Dancing, and ending the year, of course, with Greg Wallace. So the BBC has had a very challenging year with regards to reputational risk. But one that I wanted to shine a particular light on was the Harrods scandal, which broke in September and has continued to fill the headlines up until this present day. I'm sure you will all be aware of the allegations against Mohammed Al-Fayed and the alleged depth and breadth of misdeeds and wrongdoing which went on at Harrods during his period owning and running that business. There are definitively some learnings for all of us from both the previous reputational crises and the Harrods debacle. Number one, reputational crises can pose existential threats. These are crises which are about the very being of your organization, what it tolerates, what it won't tolerate, what's acceptable, what is unacceptable, and they speak to the very heart and essence of an organization, and for that reason they have the potential to do maximum damage to the organization. The Harrods example and some of the others mean that this second point is really important. Beware ticking time bombs. There is no expiry date for a crisis. Just because something happened 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, maybe under previous leadership teams, that is still a potential crisis to be dealt with today or next year in 2025. And the reason why these particular crises have filled so much of the media is because ultimately the biggest crises are always about people. A crisis is a crisis because someone has been injured or worse, or harmed, or lost their jobs, or denied money, or denied a service. Crises are about people, and the greater the harm to people, the bigger the crisis. And undoubtedly, in a number of the incidents we've been just looking at, people have been harmed. As always, the cover-up often causes more harm than the issue itself. And I think what's interesting when we look at the Harrods example, amongst others, crises do create a ripple effect. In other words, we saw on this slide that the doctors' regulator got drawn into this crisis because they apparently didn't investigate the medical tests that women were being forced to undergo at Harrods. The police, the Metropolitan Police, have been drawn in because they have been accused of not taking the allegations seriously enough. Selfridges have been named in the coverage because its boss, who formerly worked for Harrods, was quizzed about whether he knew anything about the allegations. So even if your organisation is not at the heart of the crisis itself, there is the potential to be drawn into it. So how can we avoid a crisis of this kind? Of course, it's about not engaging or allowing the kind of practices that took place at a number of these organisations in the first place, and that begins with creating a crisis-resistant culture. one in which the early signs of crisis or wrongdoing can be identified and are heard and listened to and acted upon by those who have the power to do so. When the crisis breaks, or even before it breaks, get ahead of the story. Again, in a number of the examples that we've just seen, it felt like the organisation in question was responding to a story, a narrative, which was being led by others. It's scary and nerve-wracking to go out and communicate proactively and set the narrative, set the communication agenda, but in the long term, it is frequently the best way to go. And ultimately, this is where leaders must step forward, and despite the discomfort with having to address some of these issues, historic or not, they have to show the courage to both do and say the right things. So, same question again, as per the cyber risk. Did your organisation run a reputational crisis exercise in 2024? Okay, so I think we're nearly there again. So when we look at the answers there, they are more than completely reversed compared with have you run a cyber exercise. I would contend that a reputational crisis is another of those kinds of crises that can affect all organizations, and as we have seen, can cause significant harm to an organization. Exercising around a reputational crisis, and we've seen some really challenging topics on those previous few slides, can be uncomfortable, very uncomfortable and unpalatable for teams to go through. However, it is an important crisis type. It can do enormous harm, and because of their sensitivity, they are often the most challenging to respond to. So why wouldn't you rehearse for one of the most challenging crisis types that there is? I would urge you to consider running a reputational crisis exercise next year, not just operational or technological exercises. Let's now move on to a North American story which has rippled around the world over the last, how many years is it now? A good 5 years in total, but continues, and that's Boeing. I'm sure all know about the tragic air crashes which occurred in 2019 and 2020, which claimed the lives of over 300 people. I'm sure that by the beginning of 2024, Boeing was really hoping that it had put its troubles and its crisis behind it. Sadly for them, that was far from the case. The year began on the 7th of January with a significant issue on an Alaska Airlines jet. You'll probably recall the door blew out of the plane, and through, I think, probably good fortune rather than anything else, there were no serious injuries as a result of that incident. However, it was the opportunity for the spotlight to be shone on Boeing once again. And in March, it was announced that Dave Calhoun, who was not the CEO at the time of the original accidents, would be departing. Criticism and comment about Boeing's attitude to safety over the preceding years was very much to the fore again, and the tragic death of one of the whistleblowers in that process. Lawsuits escalated, criminal charges were recommended, more coverage about alleged pressure from Boeing leaders to compromise on safety, and then the year finishing with a major strike and a plea deal over the fatal 737 MAX crashes rejected. Boeing have had a really, really tough 5 years, and 2024 didn't bring an end to that. What can we learn? No organization is too big to fail. Boeing is an iconic organization, a ubiquitous organization, an organization who I imagine pretty much every single person on this call will have traveled on many Boeing airliners, but that size, that history, that preeminence has not saved it from an extraordinary 5-year journey of crisis management. And that 5-year journey began with getting their initial crisis response to those 2 crashes wrong, which means that we, as good crisis management professionals, need to do everything in our power to get that first response right, because how you set off in a crisis sets the tone for what follows. And it's hard to recover from even 24 hours of an ill-considered response. When that response continues to go wrong for days or even weeks, it is almost impossible to crawl out of the crisis that you have found yourself in. And once that starts, once you find yourself in that spotlight, it's very hard to get out, both because if, as in Boeing's case, things seem to keep on going wrong, but also because that spotlight is much brighter and it is focused on you. When you've had one crisis, the media and other stakeholders will be watching much more closely, so they spot things and cover things that wouldn't otherwise make the headlines. So that comes back to prevent the crisis if you can, but if you can't, get that initial response right. And as we've seen on the previous slide, mishandled crises claim lives, they cost jobs, they end careers, they ruin reputations, and they cost billions of dollars. And it's a challenge for all of us on this call that work in crisis management, resilience, business continuity, communication, to play our own small part in preventing those crises and or facilitating a really effective crisis response. I wanted to move on to the organisation at the very centre of the word cloud that we saw at the beginning of the presentation. Again, I'd encourage you to make any comments or ask any questions via the questions pane. We're getting into the final 15 to 20 minutes of the presentation. So we know that on July the 19th, Friday the 19th of July, CrowdStrike had a major issue with a software update which rippled across millions of different organizations and caused the blue screen on Microsoft devices that you are seeing here. And beyond the financial impact on CrowdStrike, this rippled out again. So other organizations were drawn into this crisis because of the spread that CrowdStrike has in terms of its technology within thousands, millions of organizations. It became a crisis for Delta because their response to the outage was deemed to be significantly worse than their peers. Again, it's about getting your response right. The story when a crisis occurs also morphs. So it began by being an operational issue. It then becomes a reputational, and on the right-hand side, a legal issue. The other reason that, mention the legal issue, it's one of many parts of a crisis which sucks up huge amounts of management time. We know how stretched workforces are at the moment. The last thing you need is a mishandled crisis which focuses the time of some of the most senior people within the organization and some of the most specialist experts within the organization in putting right a crisis which potentially need not have happened. So, what are some of the learnings from the CrowdStrike incident that can help us to be better prepared? Well, first thing is to recognize that being a big, successful business with a strong reputation is not enough to protect you from harm in crisis. CrowdStrike is all of those things: big, successful, and a strong reputation. However, as it says here, that doesn't mean that you can't be affected by a crisis. So complacency or overconfidence needs to be combated. How do we do that? Well, create a crisis-resistant culture. Again, one which is humble enough to recognize that bad things can affect us, and that if they do, they can do us serious harm. And therefore, we need to do everything in our power to prevent crisis and create an environment in which people are able to spot problems quickly, raise the flag, and get those problems attended to. It also requires visible senior leadership for crisis management to create this crisis-resistant culture. I was speaking to two organizations from the same sector earlier this year. They were actually direct competitors. One of them, their leadership teams mandate at least 2 full simulations a year, and the leaders are the first people through the door when the simulation takes place. The other one mandates a single exercise per year. That can be a tabletop 90-minute affair, and frequently the leaders don't attend at all. The difference between those two approaches and what it says about how seriously senior management take protecting the organization, I think that speaks volumes. Risk assessment. Risk assess for not just operational and financial matters, but for reputational risks, and particularly relevant to what happened with CrowdStrike. Risk assess for third-party impact. Which of your business partners, suppliers, or customers could bring your business to a halt? Or vice versa, who could you do harm to? Identify those single points of failure and commit to planning, training, exercise, and learning so that you can be ready to respond should the worst happen. A crisis that strikes at your raison d'etre threatens your very existence. In other words, CrowdStrike exists to avoid, to help organizations avoid harm to their business because of a cyber incident. For CrowdStrike to cause harm to organizations because of a technological issue is particularly unhelpful. So think about your organization, both in terms of what it does, what is at the core of your proposition to your clients or customers, and what is at the core of what your organization stands for, to truly understand what are those existential risks that would do most harm to your reputation or your business. One of the best ways of doing this, one of the most effective ways of doing this, is a pre-mortem, to run a workshop where you talk through or imagine a situation where your business no longer exists, and brainstorm amongst the group how that could possibly happen. What kind of a crisis could cause that to happen? And then, of course, having done that, you can then prepare preventative strategies and contingencies to make the risk of that happening significantly less. Train and rehearse for those existential risks. I remember talking to an organisation in the mining sector who refused to countenance the absolute worst case, and instead would only rehearse against medium level risks. That organisation was unlucky enough to have a tailings dam fail in a big way, and that is, one of the most damaging and dangerous things that can happen to a mining company. And they found it very, very hard to respond to that because they'd never truly rehearsed for the worst case. And that organisation, I'm speaking to their head of crisis a couple of years after this incident, he said, no longer does anyone question the value of rehearsing for almost the unthinkable, something that we just believe can't happen, but actually it could, and if it did, it could threaten our very existence. So think about what are your existential risks, reduce your vulnerability to them as far as you can, then contingency plan, train and rehearse. Effective crisis management means simultaneously doing and saying the right things, both of those at the same time. So the implication of that is scenario planning. Walk through against your risk landscape. What resources would you need to respond to some of our biggest risks? What technology, what expertise would we need, both within our own team, but also advisors, and who would be our critical partners? And sometimes you may operate with joint venture partners, or you have suppliers or customers who are almost integrated within your organization. Have the conversations beforehand to say, what is our role? What is your role? What are your expectations of how we would respond to a crisis? And what does your crisis management plan say compared with our crisis management plan? Don't wait to have the crisis to find the answer to those questions. Do the same thing with communication. Who would be affected? Who would have influence in this situation? Whose help would we need? Who are the priority stakeholders? How would we communicate them? What about if we don't have email? What about if our website has been taken down? What would we say? What would the messaging be? And what would be the triggers for proactive communication? So scenario plan, the communication response. And critically, again, and this requires the active involvement of your leaders, scenario plan decision making. In a situation of this kind against one of our existential risks, what are the likely critical decisions that would need to be made? Who would have the responsibility for making those decisions? And what would our in-principle decisions be? And what might be the criteria for deciding option A rather than deciding on option B? Who would approve those communication materials? What input is comms going to have? What input is legal going to have? These are all things that organizations that didn't do them ahead of the event wish they had when crisis came a-calling. Tone of voice. When crisis strikes, accurate, timely and empathetic communication is essential to retain trust. CrowdStrike were very timely with their communication, and they put out lots of facts. This was the first communication from George Kurtz, the CEO, within a couple of hours of the incident arising. It's a good statement, but the one thing that it lacked was humanity, care, and empathy. It's strong on fact, strong on commitment, but a little bit light on empathy. By day 3, that tone had completely changed. Sean Henry, the Chief Security Officer here, posting on LinkedIn in very, very human, emotional language. Again, try and get that tone right from day 1. Don't learn over the first couple of days that actually your crisis communication needs to communicate empathy and concern for those affected. Show visible leadership. This is something that CrowdStrike did very well. Again, George Kurtz here on network TV within hours of the incident, very much front and center, very much taking ownership, very much filling the information vacuum. So who would your spokespeople be? Under what circumstances would they step forward? Who are the deputies? What are the messages? Have they been trained under pressure to communicate effectively in crisis? The other thing that CrowdStrike did really well was to fill the information vacuum and thereby shaped the narrative. They very quickly established on their website a hub which contained the critical information that you needed to know about the incident, thereby positioning themselves as the go-to and the most credible commentator on the situation. In a crisis, as I said before, it's uncomfortable being in the spotlight, but actually if anyone's going to be communicating, you want it to be you. You want to be shaping the narrative rather than experts, critics, and commentators. Interestingly, here in the UK, the Financial Conduct Authority, and I think Sandra's on the call today from the FCA, they looked at the CrowdStrike incident, not with an analysis of CrowdStrike itself, but an analysis of those that were struck by the outage and what they saw as some of the key learnings from how those organizations responded. And the key things that the FCA is recommending is that you should identify and mitigate single points of failure. CrowdStrike was one in this instance. Map and assess third-party relationships. Determine how to communicate with them in crisis. Ensure management and staff are aware of crisis management processes. The FCA found that some of the organisations that they deal with have done a very good job of briefing their teams and their broader staff on how to respond to crisis, and others haven't. Test crisis notification. You may have the best crisis plan in the world, but unless you can notify the right people that something has happened and that they need to act in a certain way, then that crisis management plan will not be as effective as it should be. Pre-prepare your crisis communication. The FCA said those that had got template materials prepared beforehand, those who had worked out how they would communicate with their stakeholders, whether they're customers, investors, employees, those that had thought it through were able to respond much more effectively. Agree responsibilities with business partners beforehand. Again, this comes back to the point of you may be hand in glove with a number of business partners. You need to mutually understand who is responsible for what and who is going to do what, so that you don't have surprises on the most challenging day of your business life. And they also, the FCA recommended rehearsing against severe but plausible scenarios. Again, they found that those that had responded more confidently than those that hadn't. So, what's that meant financially for CrowdStrike? Well, this is an interesting graph. This is from the day of the incident, literally to yesterday, and you will see that the immediate fall in the share price was dramatic. The red line, by the way, is the NASDAQ. The blue line is CrowdStrike. And for a long time, in the intervening, 5 months, CrowdStrike has lagged below where it should be if it was simply to mirror the NASDAQ. But based on some strong fourth quarter results, it is now only underperforming the market by 3% compared with where it was on the day of the crisis. There is still concern about how many subscribers will remain with CrowdStrike next year, so it will be fascinating to continue to track the value impact. As I mentioned before, whether or not the value of CrowdStrike falls, what we do know is that every media article and millions of hours of management time have been focused on responding to that crisis over that 5-month period. So as we start to look forward, and again, I apologize, I've got my years wrong on this one. What risks are you most concerned about in 2025? Could I ask you to paste into the box what you are most concerned about next year? Okay, let's see what's appearing. Okay, so cyber, which is kind of represented with in at least 3 different ways, remains, based on this word cloud alone, the risk that unites everybody on this call. It's clear that geopolitics of various kinds are an increasing concern, and I think that's not surprising given what we've seen over the last 12 months. I can see reputational challenges there. We've got weather, extreme weather, geopolitical. So a wide range of potential risks. One that I would add specifically to that list is AI mis and disinformation. We're just starting to see the early signs, I think, of corporates, businesses really being targeted via deep fakes in particular. 3 examples from the last 6 months. WPP, the big advertising firm, they were targeted with a deep fake of their CEO, as were Ferrari. The only reason that the attempt on Ferrari was foiled was that the person who allegedly thought they were talking to the Ferrari CEO on a Teams call, his voice and his image had been cloned. The only reason that he was able to identify that it wasn't the case was when he asked him, "Remind me of that book that you recommended to me last week." So WPP and Ferrari managed to avoid falling into the trap of the cyber criminals. The engineering firm Arup didn't, and a £20 million payment was made as a result of an AI generated video call. So it's a version, I guess, of a cyber threat, but I think it is one where the wrong kind of people are seeing an opportunity to make a significant amount of money. So before closing, I wanted to first of all deal with a couple of questions. Yeah, Patrick saying it'd be great to compare the CrowdStrike stock price to Boeing. I will do that, Patrick, not in the next 2 minutes, but it's a great point, and I think that would be really interesting. Piali asking about the golden hour. Yeah, the golden hour was something that was talked about in the earlier stages of my career. I think we still have to be realistic about balancing speed and the gathering of some information. I think to get a very generic communication out within an hour should be the target. To get something more meaningful out, I would say it's probably 3 hours these days. And it is that constant tug of war between speed and accuracy. Yeah, so I'm talking about supply chain disruption, definitely a critical risk. Right, in the last couple of minutes before we close this session, I wanted, as I mentioned right at the start, to suggest some listening for those people who are real crisis management aficionados and want to turn away from the holiday TV and engage in some hopefully stimulating, I think in some cases entertaining, but also relevant Christmas listening and reading. 3 podcasts that I love and would recommend. The one in the middle, the Lazarus Heist, is story of cybercrime, major cyber incidents and the tangled web behind it. 13 Minutes to the Moon, the story of Apollo 13, the Houston We Have a Problem mission. There's one particular episode where they focus on the moment when they recognized they did have a problem and how they responded to it. And it's so full of crisis management learnings. It's amazing. The rest is history. And in particular, there is, I think it's a 6-part series on the sinking of the Titanic. This is, you know, a crisis from what, a century and a half ago. But it's a fascinating listen, and there are lessons about thinking the unthinkable, about leadership in crisis, about how you organize yourselves in crisis. So I would commend that. If you're not a listener but a reader, 5 books here. Exposure, which is very much about crisis culture, what I've talked about, how a CEO joined an organization, found wrongdoing, tried to expose it, and then almost became a victim of it himself. Flying Blind, we talked about Boeing earlier on, really fascinating insight into what, according to the author, went on behind the scenes at Boeing. Dead in the Water, this reads like a spy thriller, but it's the story of a tragic event and what happened within the shipping industry. Lucy Easthope's book is great. She worked for Kenyon, literally responding after a crisis, particularly with families and those who had been injured or worse in a crisis. Really emphasizes the importance of people in crisis. And Mindset by Carol Dweck. This relates to what we've been doing this afternoon, taking the learnings out of crises, and when we do an exercise, focusing not just on what went wrong and what we could do better, but what went well and how we can build on our capabilities. So 5 suggestions for books there, plus one really good book by some guy called Jonathan Hemus, Crisis Proof. If you fancy getting a Christmas present for your loved one, it's available on Amazon. But because I'm a very benevolent Santa Claus, There will also be 3 copies for the first 3 people to drop me a line requesting one. So you can put that in your Christmas stocking if you're amongst the first 3 to respond. I wanted to finish with 5 New Year's resolutions. Number 1, as crisis management and resilience professionals, let's champion a crisis-resistant culture. Please develop risk-agnostic crisis management plans. We've seen just a smattering of the risk types that we can face. Make sure that your plans are not just a series of playbooks, which will only work if your top 5 predicted risks occur. Get yourself a risk-agnostic crisis management plan, scenario plan before, during, and after crisis. Be the kind of organization and individual that asks, what if, challenge, probe, plan based on that scenario planning. Practice, practice, practice. Of all the things that we do for our clients, I firmly believe that exercising is the most important and the most valuable element of all. It builds confidence in the plan, it builds capability within the team, and it creates that ability to work effectively in crisis through having experienced it and through building mental muscle memory. And as we have been doing today, act on learnings. Don't just learn, but act on those learnings so that you are less likely to have a crisis in 2025 and more likely to respond to them effectively if they do occur. My apologies for overrunning by 3 minutes. Thank you for joining me here today. If I haven't got to your question or there's anything else that you would like to ask, please do contact me. If you're not already a client of Insignia, we'd love to work with you in 2025, so please do get in touch. But in the meantime, have not just a peaceful and crisis-free afternoon, but also a peaceful and crisis-free holiday season. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.